September 21st, 1931. A quiet Monday morning in London that ended an era. Before that day, the British pound was not just money, it was a religion. As good as gold was the promise that held the empire together. But by noon, the government suspended the gold standard. In a single heartbeat, the savings of a lifetime transformed from a guaranteed store of value into mere paper. The people who trusted the system the most were the ones who lost everything. You might look back at them with pity, thinking we are smarter now. But when you stand at the checkout counter today, watching your hard-earned money buy less than it did a year ago, you are feeling the exact same mechanism at work. Monetary orders do not collapse by accident. They collapse because eventually, resetting the game is the only way to erase a debt that can never be paid. There is a seduction in the modern world that is dangerous to your wealth. We look at our high-frequency trading algorithms, our instant global transfers, and our central bank computers, and we feel a sense of superiority. We look back at the panic of the 1930s, or the bank runs of the 19th century, with a detached amusement, thinking that those people were naive. We tell ourselves that we have learned from their mistakes, that our financial architecture is too sophisticated to fail in the same crude way. But this arrogance is exactly where the trap lies. Two economists, Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff, spent years compiling a forensic database spanning 8 centuries across 66 countries. They wanted to see if there was a mathematical DNA to financial disaster. Their conclusion was cold and absolute. Financial crises are not anomalies. They are not rare, unpredictable events that strike from nowhere. They are the rhythmic heartbeat of every monetary system that has ever existed. Whether it is a sovereign debt default, a banking panic, or a hyperinflationary collapse, the patterns are startlingly identical. The only thing that changes is the excuse we use to justify the bubble. This phenomenon has a name. This time is different. It is the recurring delusion that the old laws of economics have been suspended by a new era of technology or insight. Before the 2008 crash, the narrative was seductive. We were told that financial innovation, combined with global capital flows and productivity growth, had created a stable, great moderation. We believed that by chopping up risky subprime mortgages and repackaging them into complex derivatives, we had mathematically eliminated the risk of default. We didn't eliminate risk, we just hid it in the basement where the regulators weren't looking. The boom created an illusion of prosperity that masked the systemic rot, right up until the moment confidence evaporated. This brings us to the quiet anxiety you might feel when you read the financial news today. You are often dismissed as a pessimist or a doom-scroller for worrying about the national debt or the stability of the currency. But looking at 800 years of data suggests that your anxiety is actually a form of pattern recognition. The common denominator in almost every crisis in history is the excessive accumulation of debt. It always starts the same way. A boom fueled by easy money makes everyone feel like a genius. Governments borrow because they can. Corporations leverage up because money is cheap. And individuals feel wealthy because asset prices are rising. But debt is just a claim on future labor. When the pile of claims becomes larger than the economy's ability to produce, the system must reset. The names of the instruments change from clipped coins to paper notes to digital swaps, but the mechanism of leverage remains the same. The script of this play never actually changes, only the actors do. We keep falling for this trap because for a brief window in history, we actually had a system that forced us to be honest. It was a harsh discipline, a golden pair of handcuffs that kept the political ambition of printing money in check. It was a time when stability was valued more than promises, at least until we decided that the cost of that discipline was too high to pay. Imagine a world where the value of the money in your pocket is as unyielding as the heavy metal bars locked in a central bank vault. This was the classical gold standard, a period often romanticized as a golden era of stability and discipline. But we need to look at this system not through the lens of economic theory, but through the cold lens of power. Before 1914, international money was a tool of the elite, yet designed by people who viewed external stability, the prestige of the currency on the global stage, as far more important than the internal stability of a working man's dinner table. The logic was simple and brutal. If a country lost gold, the central bank would raise interest rates, choking the domestic economy to force prices and wages down. It was a deliberate act of deflation. They called it sound money, and a civilized virtue. In reality, it was a mechanism that prioritized the wealth of those who already held assets, the creditors and the gold owners, while shifting the entire burden of adjustment onto the backs of those who had the least to give. Why did this system survive for so long? The answer isn't economic efficiency, it is political insulation. In the 19th century, the people suffering from these harsh austerity measures didn't have a voice. Labor unions were weak, and the right to vote was a privilege reserved for the few. Governments didn't have to worry about unemployment figures or social unrest at the ballot box, because the people most affected by the gold standard's discipline simply weren't part of the political equation. It was an era of profound information asymmetry. The elite understood the game, and they played it to ensure their capital remained safe, regardless of the domestic cost. The gold standard acted as a golden pair of handcuffs, not just on the government's ability to print money, but on the public's ability to demand a better life. It was a world where the currency was moral because it was scarce, but that morality was enforced by a system that was fundamentally indifferent to human suffering. We are often told that returning to such a system would solve our modern problems of inflation and debt. But those who advocate for this forget that the gold standard wasn't just about gold. It was about the power to ignore the masses. It was a regime that could only exist when the state was a fortress, shielded from the messy, urgent demands of a population that wanted to eat. The system held because the social order was rigid, but the world was changing. The trauma of a global war was about to rip those shields away, leaving the elite to face a new and terrifying reality. The golden handcuffs were about to be tested by a force they never accounted for, the rising voice of a public that had finally realized that the value of their money was being used as a weapon against them. The end of the Great War in 1918 didn't just redraw maps, it rewired the human psyche. Soldiers returned from the mud of the trenches to find a world that finally had to listen to them. This was the birth of mass politics, and for the gold standard mentalite of the elite, it was the beginning of the end. You see, the gold standard had functioned on a silent agreement, that the stability of the currency was more important than the survival of the citizen. But once the common man gained the right to vote and labor unions began to flex their muscles, that agreement was torn to shreds. Suddenly, the civilized virtue of deflation, raising interest rates and cutting wages to protect gold reserves, became a political suicide note. Imagine being a politician in 1925. You could follow the old rules, protect the exchange rate, and watch your cities erupt in strikes as unemployment soared. Or you could break the rules, print money to fund social welfare, and keep your seat. The choice was never really about economics. It was about survival. The impossible trinity of finance had met the reality of the ballot box. You cannot have a fixed exchange rate, free capital movement, and an independent monetary policy that serves the voters all at the same time. The central bankers of the 1920s tried to play a desperate game of pretend. They attempted to reconstruct a gold exchange standard, a fragile imitation of the pre-war order. But the trust was gone. Markets realized that governments were no longer insulated from domestic pressure. Every time a country faced an economic dip, investors didn't see a disciplined response. They saw a government that was one protest away from devaluing its currency. The gold standard, once a symbol of unshakable faith, had become a prison that every inmate was looking for a way to escape. They called their hesitance flexible policy or managed stability. In reality, it was a quiet admission of a new addiction, the addiction to spending money that didn't exist. The elite realized that if they couldn't cut wages without a revolution, they would have to find a way to make those wages worth less without anyone noticing. This ideological trap is what turned a standard recession into the Great Depression. By clinging to the ghost of gold while being haunted by the fear of the masses, they paralyzed the world economy until it finally snapped. When the system finally shattered in the early 1930s, the masks came off. The world entered an era of floating rates and capital controls, where the primary goal was no longer to be honorable in the eyes of London or New York, but to keep the domestic peace at any cost. Gold was sidelined, but the problem of debt remained. The masters of the system needed a new way to deal with the mountain of promises they had made to their people. They needed a way to default on their debts without ever having to say the word bankrupt. They found their answer in a mechanism so subtle that even today most people don't realize they are paying for it every time they buy a loaf of bread. There is a fundamental truth about debt that every government knows but rarely admits. They have no intention of ever paying it back in the value they borrowed it. When a nation's debt reaches a certain mountain, the math of honesty breaks down. At this crossroads, there are only two ways out. The first is a hard default, admitting bankruptcy, a loud and humiliating collapse of credit. The second is far more elegant. It is a soft default, a silent theft that allows them to pay every penny they owe, while simultaneously making that money worthless. This mechanism is called financial repression. It is not a conspiracy. It is a policy tool used by central banks and governments to melt away the real value of their debt without ever having to raise taxes at the ballot box. The mechanics are deceptively simple. They keep interest rates artificially low, while allowing inflation to run high. Imagine you save $100 in a bank account that pays you 3% interest. You feel like you are doing the responsible thing, building a future. But if the inflation rate is 6%, the real value of that debt for the person who borrowed it, the government, is shrinking by 3% every year. They are paying you back in dollars that have less purchasing power than the ones you earned. This is a hidden tax on everyone who holds currency or saves money, effectively transferring wealth from the savers to the biggest debtor of all, the state. If you have ever felt that you are running faster and faster just to stay in the same place, you are not being paranoid. You are witnessing the erosion of your life's work in real time. Financial repression is a slow-motion default that preserves the appearance of stability while hollowing out the middle class. The government borrows at a negative real interest rate, essentially getting paid by you to hold their debt. They call this price stability, or monetary stimulus. In reality, it is a deliberate choice to devalue the currency to save the system from its own excessive promises. They rarely default on debt in their own currency because they own the printing press. Instead, they choose inflation because it is politically easier than cutting spending or raising taxes. It is a tax that requires no legislation and no public debate. By the time you realize your savings have lost half their power, the debt that once threatened the government's survival has been effectively liquidated at your expense. This is the invisible architecture of the modern world. But as effective as this silent theft is, It relies on one fragile variable, the continued belief that the system is under control. When that belief falters, when the inflation gets too loud to ignore, the elite lose their grip on the narrative. They then resort to even more desperate measures, convincing themselves and the public that they have engineered a new era of immunity, right up until the moment the party suddenly stops. The year was 2007, and the world was drunk on an illusion of perpetual growth. This was the era of the Great Moderation, a time when the architects of our financial system actually convinced themselves that they had conquered the business cycle once and for all. From the mahogany row offices of Wall Street to the halls of the Treasury, the mood was one of untouchable hubris. While the foundations were rotting, the leaders were busy telling the public that the old rules of gravity no longer applied. The numbers told a story of a coming catastrophe, but the gatekeepers chose to ignore them. U.S. household debt-to-income ratios had skyrocketed from 80% in the early 90s to nearly 130% by mid-2006. Home prices had doubled their historical averages. Yet, when confronted with these red flags, the response from the elite was a masterclass in denial. Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill famously dismissed the current account deficit as a meaningless concept, arguing that the world just wanted to lend to America because of its superior productivity. Fed chairmen like Greenspan and Bernanke insisted that they shouldn't lean against house prices, choosing instead to focus on a narrow definition of inflation, while ignoring the massive debt bubble inflating right under their feet. While the financial sector's share of GDP doubled, growing from 4% in the mid-70s to 8% by 2007, we were told this was the result of innovation and value-added services. In reality, it was the result of mispricing risk on a global scale. They took subprime mortgages, sliced them, diced them, and gave them AAA ratings, effectively laundering bad debt into safe assets. They were betting the house, but they weren't using their own money. They were using yours. The asymmetry of this game is what makes the blood run cold. When the music finally stopped in 2008 and the world economy began to seize, the bill didn't go to the people who organized the party. It went to the taxpayers. The same leaders who had been catastrophically wrong did not lose their jobs. They were given the task of managing the bailout. You were the one who lost your home, your retirement, or your sense of security. They were the ones who kept their bonuses, funded by the very debt they had used to set the world on fire. This was the ultimate validation for the skeptics. The system isn't broken. It is working exactly as it was designed to. It socializes the losses while privatizing the gains. And yet, as the dust settled, the solution they offered was not more discipline, but more of the same medicine that had caused the sickness. They began to treat the addiction to debt with an even larger dose of debt, shifting the liability from private banks to the public balance sheet. This cycle didn't end in 2008. It simply entered a new, more dangerous phase, where the debt has grown so large that the only way to sustain it is to keep the printing presses running until the gears finally melt. Debt is a curious drug. In the beginning, it feels like growth, like a shortcut to a future you haven't earned yet. But the global economy has long since passed the recreational stage. We are now in the phase of full-blown chemical dependency. The common denominator of every financial heart attack over the last 800 years isn't just bad luck. It is the excessive, relentless accumulation of debt. When the private sector finally collapses under the weight of its own leverage, the system doesn't sober up. Instead, the government steps in to socialize the disaster, moving the toxicity from the bank's ledgers to the public balance sheet. The numbers are as cold as they are consistent. Following a major banking crisis, government debt doesn't just rise, it explodes, increasing by an average of 86% in the 3 years that follow. This isn't just about bailouts for the elite. It's because when the credit engine of a modern economy stops, growth dies with it. Tax revenues vanish, unemployment benefits soar, and the state is forced to print or borrow the difference just to keep the lights on. We are trying to heal a wound caused by debt by injecting a massive lethal dose of even more debt. It is a loop of diminishing returns where each rescue package requires a larger sacrifice of the currency's future. This is the moment where you stop looking at the price of things and start looking at the value of the denominator. People ask why gold or Bitcoin or rare assets continue to climb despite the stability of our modern institutions. The answer isn't that these assets are changing, it's that the yardstick we use to measure them, fiat currency, is shrinking. When the debt becomes unpayable, the only mathematical escape for a state is to make the currency worth less. If the government owes $1 trillion, it is in their direct interest for $1 trillion to buy a lot less than it used to. This brings us to a reality that the mainstream media rarely discusses. We aren't just living through a period of high prices. We are living through the deliberate liquidation of the public's purchasing power. Every time the central bank expands the money supply to stabilize a crisis, they are effectively diluting your life's work. They aren't fixing the economy. They are protecting the debtors by sacrificing the savers. This isn't a theory. It is the fundamental mechanism of financial repression that has allowed every over-leveraged empire in history to survive just a little bit longer. The system isn't waiting for a crash. The crash is happening in slow motion every time you go to the grocery store. We have built a world where credit is the lifeblood, but that blood is becoming increasingly toxic. The question is no longer whether the system can be saved, but how much longer the illusion of solvency can be maintained before the public finally realizes the denominator has reached its limit. We are standing at the edge of a historical veil, looking down at a pattern that has repeated for centuries. But this time the scale is global, and the safety nets have all been used up. Mark Twain was right. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. If you listen closely, you can hear the melody of the 1930s and 2008 playing once again, only this time the volume has been turned up to a deafening level. We are currently living through a period of global diversity in monetary regimes, a fragmented era that emerged after the collapse of Bretton Woods in 1971. But the structural cracks are becoming impossible to ignore. We have entered a stage where the traditional safety nets, the ones that saved the system in the past, are themselves becoming the primary source of instability. The data shows we are standing at the end of a long-term debt cycle. Public debt across the developed world has reached record highs, and just as in the past, governments are resorting to financial repression to manage the burden. We see inflation persistently running higher than nominal interest rates, a deliberate mechanism that erodes the value of what you own to save what the state owes. This isn't a theory about the future. It is the active liquidation of your purchasing power happening in real time. We are seeing a resurgence of currency wars and capital controls as nations scramble to protect their own domestic interests at the expense of global stability. History tells us that when a fixed or managed monetary order becomes too restrictive for the political needs of the masses, it eventually snaps. The gold standard mentalité of the past has been replaced by an endless stimulus mentalité, but the underlying conflict remains the same, the irreconcilable gap between the promises made by politicians and the cold reality of the balance sheet. The signs of a new era delusion are everywhere. The same this time is different syndrome that preceded every crash from the South Sea bubble to the 2008 subprime crisis. We are told that deficits don't matter because of high productivity, or that central banks can print their way to a soft landing. But the patterns of 8 centuries suggest otherwise. When the debt catalyst reaches its limit and the silent default of inflation no longer suffices, the system undergoes a structural reset. We are not waiting for a crisis, we are already inside the transition. The question is no longer if the current monetary order will shift, but when the final loss of confidence will force a new system into existence. We have exhausted the old excuses, and spent the future's wealth. As the echoes of history grow louder, the only thing left to decide is whether you will be a spectator to the collapse or someone who understood the rhyme before the music stopped. We have traveled through 8 centuries of mirrors and smoke, from the clinking of gold coins to the silent hum of digital ledgers. You have seen the masks fall away from the elite and the mechanisms of power laid bare. What many call a broken system is in fact a system functioning exactly as it was designed, to prioritize the debt of the state over the savings of the citizen. If you have felt a deep gnawing anxiety about the future, know that you were never wrong. That was not paranoia. It was your financial survival instinct, recognizing a pattern that has repeated since the first empire decided to clip its coins. But the fear ends here. By understanding the silent default of inflation and the inevitable cycle of debt, you have reclaimed your sovereignty. You are no longer a blind passenger in a vehicle with no brakes. You are now a person who knows exactly how the game is played. Knowledge of this history is the only asset they cannot dilute. While the masses chase the illusion of a soft landing, you have the intellectual clarity to prepare for the rhyme. If you are ready to continue decoding the secrets the system has tried to bury, leave a 1 inch in the comments. Welcome to Financial Money History. The storm is coming, but this time you can see it.